Stalin never said it, not once. The phrase "quantity has a quality all its own" sounds exactly like something the Soviet dictator would have uttered, dripping with cold pragmatism, perfectly suited to a man who measured success in bodies expended rather than battles won. But Joseph Stalin never spoke these words. The phrase was coined by Thomas A. Callaghan Jr., an American defense consultant working on NATO alliance issues, and it appeared in a 1979 Allied Interdependence Newsletter, 34 years after the war ended, 26 years after Stalin died. And that is not the only thing you have been told about German tanks that is simply, demonstrably, mathematically wrong. Walk into any comment section beneath a video about Tigers or Panthers. Scroll through any forum thread about German armoured doctrine. You will find the same refrain repeated with religious certainty. Germany should have mass-produced Panzer IVs and StuGs instead of wasting resources on heavy tanks. The people typing this believe they have discovered a profound insight. Some hidden wisdom that escaped the notice of German planners but is obvious to anyone with hindsight and a Wikipedia article. What they have actually done is apply American industrial logic to a country that was not America. The United States had unlimited oil, untouched factories, a population that exceeded Germany's by 50%. Germany, by late 1944, had synthetic fuel plants being systematically bombed into rubble, railways severed in dozens of places, trained manpower that had been fed into the maw of the Eastern Front for 3 consecutive years. But here's the thing, the armchair historians never ask the obvious follow-up questions. Where exactly would the crews for these phantom thousands of medium tanks have come from? Who would have driven the fuel trucks to supply them? And through which rail junctions, the same ones being cratered by 1,000 bomber raids every week, would these miracle tanks have reached the front? This is not speculation. This is not opinion. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined this exact question after the war. They had full access to German industrial records, Speer's ministry files, interrogations of the men who actually ran the German war economy. The CIA conducted follow-up analyses. Multiple post-war studies from Allied intelligence agencies pored over the numbers, the production schedules, the logistics networks, the manpower statistics. Their conclusion, reached after examining mountains of primary documentation that most YouTube commenters have never heard of, let alone read, was unambiguous. Building more medium tanks instead of heavy tanks would have made no meaningful difference to the outcome of the war. The bottleneck was never production capacity. The bottleneck was everything that happened after the tank rolled off the assembly line, the fuel that didn't exist, the trained crews who had been killed faster than they could be replaced, the rail network that could no longer move anything heavier than a bicycle without attracting the attention of fighter bombers. The armchair historians have been prosecuting German industrial planners for 7 decades, using evidence that the actual investigators dismissed as irrelevant. Let me show you why. Between September and November 1944, German factories manufactured 2,199 tanks. That number should have been more than sufficient to mount serious defensive operations across both fronts. But less than half of those tanks ever reached German forces. Not because they were destroyed in transit, though some were. Not because they broke down, though maintenance was a constant nightmare. Less than half reached the front, because the catastrophic disruption of the rail network meant there was physically no way to move them. You could have built 10,000 tanks, 20,000 tanks, covered every factory floor in Germany with medium armour. It would not have mattered 1 fraction of a percentage point if you couldn't get them to the soldiers who needed them. The constraint wasn't production. The constraint was transportation. And building smaller, lighter tanks doesn't conjure functioning railway bridges out of the craters left by Lancaster bombers. The German rail network had been the logistical spine of the Wehrmacht since 1939. It moved everything: ammunition, food, replacement troops, the actual fighting vehicles that made blitzkrieg possible. By early 1944, Allied strategic bombing had begun systematically targeting that spine with an intensity that defied German repair capabilities. In the northern region alone, military train capacity fell from 58,000 tons per day in early March 1944 to barely 25,000 tons per day by early May, a collapse of more than 50% in just 2 months. This wasn't gradual degradation, this was catastrophic systems failure. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding the Western Front, was forced to pull 18,000 workers off Atlantic Wall construction simply to attempt railway repairs. And those repairs were immediately strafed and bombed again by Allied pilots who understood exactly what they were destroying. The idea that Germany could have solved its armoured problem by producing more tanks rests on the fantasy that those tanks could have reached the battlefield. The evidence says they could not. So that's the first pillar of the more medium tanks argument demolished. Transportation was collapsing. More tanks would have sat in rail yards waiting for trains that weren't coming. But what about the crews who would operate these hypothetical vehicles? This is where the argument collapses entirely. A tank without a trained crew is not a weapon. It's a pillbox, a static obstacle that cannot maneuver, cannot coordinate with infantry, cannot perform the fluid offensive and defensive operations that made armoured warfare decisive in the first place. And by late 1944, Germany did not have the trained crews to operate the tanks it already possessed, let alone thousands of hypothetical additional vehicles. The manpower crisis wasn't a minor logistical inconvenience. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was roughly 800,000 men short of complete strength. This wasn't a deficit that could be made up by conscription or reserve mobilization, because those measures had already been taken to their absolute limits. The age ranges for military service had been expanded both upward and downward: middle-aged men, teenage boys. The hastily organized Volkssturm units were filling out with men who had received perhaps a few hours of training before being handed obsolete weapons and told to hold positions against Soviet armor. The idea that Germany could have found additional tank crews in this environment isn't merely optimistic, it is detached from reality. Consider the crew mathematics carefully. Really think about this. A King Tiger required 5 crew members. A StuG 3 required 4. If Germany had built 2,000 StuGs instead of 500 King Tigers, those StuGs would have required 8,000 crew members. The King Tigers required only 2,500. That's 5,500 additional trained tankers who didn't exist, couldn't be trained, would never materialize, regardless of what vehicles the factories produced. The more medium tanks advocates have proposed a solution that requires conjuring 5,500 trained soldiers from thin air, and they have never once addressed where these men would come from. But it gets worse. The specific problem of armoured crew training makes the deficit even more acute. Late-war German Panzer Corps suffered from a catastrophic lack of trained crews. Commanders were forced to rush young, badly trained crew members to the front lines to operate new designs they barely understood. A tank crew is not interchangeable with infantry. You cannot take a rifleman and put him in a Panzer IV turret and expect him to function effectively in combined arms operations. Tank gunnery requires extensive practice. Tank driving requires mechanical familiarity that takes months to develop. Tank commanders need tactical judgment that comes only from experience. The losses on the Eastern Front had been systematically annihilating this experienced cadre since 1941. By 1944, the pipeline of replacement crews had narrowed to a trickle of undertrained boys thrown into machines they weren't qualified to operate. And the training pipeline itself had been throttled by the same fuel crisis that constrained everything else in the German war machine. Tank training requires fuel, substantial quantities of fuel, driving instruction, gunnery practice, tactical exercises. All of it burns petroleum. By September 1944, Allied bombing had reduced German petroleum, oil and lubricants production by 95%, down from 316,000 tons in April to just 17,000 tons. Read that again. From 316,000 tons to 17,000 tons. This wasn't a shortage. This was annihilation. The synthetic fuel plants that Germany had built specifically to reduce dependence on foreign oil were being systematically destroyed. And with them went any possibility of maintaining the training tempo required to produce competent armoured crews. You cannot train a tank driver without diesel. You cannot train a tank gunner without ammunition and the fuel to manoeuvre targets. The entire system was starving simultaneously. Which brings us to the internal contradiction that none of the more medium tanks advocates ever seem to notice. And it is remarkable, genuinely remarkable, that so few people catch themselves walking into this logical trap. The same voices that insist Germany should have produced more Panzer IVs and StuGs also acknowledge, often in the same breath, certainly in the same videos and forum posts, that Germany couldn't supply its existing armoured forces with adequate fuel. They'll tell you about Tigers running out of petrol in the Ardennes. They'll tell you about Panthers abandoned because there was nothing to fill their tanks. They'll tell you about the chronic, systemic, utterly devastating fuel shortage that paralysed German armoured operations from mid-1944 onward. And then they'll turn around and suggest that building more tanks would have helped. Think about what this argument actually proposes. You have a military that cannot fuel the tanks it already has. Your synthetic oil plants have been bombed into rubble. Your rail network cannot move supplies to the front. Your fuel trucks are being destroyed by fighter bombers before they can reach forward units. And the solution is to build more tanks? More vehicles competing for the same inadequate fuel supply? More engines burning petrol that doesn't exist? This isn't strategic wisdom. This is mathematical illiteracy dressed up as historical analysis. The fuel situation during the Ardennes offensive provides a perfect case study. Germany stockpiled 507 million gallons of fuel for the offensive, an enormous quantity, carefully hoarded over months of reduced operations elsewhere. This was supposed to be enough to reach the Meuse and potentially Antwerp, to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace in the West. But only half of that stockpile was ever delivered to the units that needed it. Not because of combat losses, not because of Allied interdiction, though that played a role. Half of the fuel never reached the front because the transportation network simply could not move it. The trucks didn't exist in sufficient numbers. The railways had been cut in too many places. The roads were clogged with vehicles that were themselves running out of fuel. More tanks would not have helped this situation. More tanks would have made it worse. More vehicles competing for the same inadequate fuel deliveries. More engines sitting empty. More crews stranded beside their machines, waiting for supplies that would never arrive. Germany relied on 16 highly vulnerable synthetic oil production plants to produce 75% of its aviation gasoline from coal-based synthesis. These plants were large, conspicuous, impossible to disperse, and absolutely essential to continued operations. They were, in other words, ideal bombing targets. The Allies understood this perfectly. And they made oil plants a strategic priority. Each successful raid reduced not just current fuel production, but German capacity to resist. Aircraft couldn't fly to defend the plants if there was no aviation fuel. And there was no aviation fuel if the plants had been bombed. A vicious cycle that the Luftwaffe couldn't escape. The armoured forces competed for the same inadequate fuel supply. By late 1944, there simply wasn't enough to go around, regardless of how many tanks Germany possessed. Now comes the mathematics that demolishes the core assumption of the entire more medium tanks argument. The assumption is this: smaller tanks are more fuel efficient per unit of combat power delivered. Build more StuGs, the argument goes, because they're smaller, cheaper, and consume less fuel than Tigers. You get more bang for your limited resources. This assumption is false. A King Tiger consumed approximately 500 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres of road travel. A StuG-3 consumed approximately 200 litres per 100 kilometres. At first glance, this seems to favour the StuG. It uses less than half the fuel. Obvious choice, right? But now apply the combat power ratio that even the most generous estimates acknowledge. You need at minimum 2 to 2.5 StuGs to equal the combat effectiveness of one King Tiger in a defensive engagement, and likely more in offensive operations, where the Tiger's superior armour allows it to survive hits that would destroy a StuG instantly. Run the numbers. 500 King Tigers consuming 500 litres per 100 kilometres equals 250,000 litres per 100 kilometres of operation. The 2,000 StuGs that the more medium tanks argument would substitute require 200 litres each per 100 kilometres. That equals 400,000 litres per 100 kilometres. 4 times as many vehicles, consuming 60% more fuel, for roughly equivalent combat power. The title of this documentary is not hyperbole, it is mathematics. 500 King Tigers actually used less fuel than 2,000 StuGs to deliver equivalent defensive capability. The people repeating they should have built more StuGs have never done this calculation. They have assumed that smaller equals more efficient, without checking whether their assumption survives contact with arithmetic. It doesn't. And the production cost myths are equally detached from reality. You will find claims that a Tiger cost 5 or 6 times as much as a medium tank. You will find assertions that the resources consumed by one Tiger could have produced a platoon of Panzer IVs. You will find these numbers stated with absolute confidence by people who have never looked at the actual Reichsmark figures from German wartime accounting. The real numbers tell a different story. A Tiger I tank cost 250,800 Reichsmarks to produce. A StuG-3 Ausf-G cost 82,500 Reichsmarks. That's a ratio of approximately 3 to 1. Not 5 to 1, not 6 to 1, 3 to 1. 3 StuGs for 1 Tiger. Not 5, not 6. When you factor in the crew requirements, 5 men for a Tiger, 4 for a StuG, the training demands, the fuel consumption, and the combat effectiveness ratios, the Tiger starts to look considerably less extravagant than the mythology suggests. The man-hours comparison is similarly revealing once you examine actual production data rather than invented ratios. A single Tiger I tank required 300,000 man-hours to produce. This sounds enormous until you compare it to other German armoured vehicles. A Panther tank cost 117,100 Reichsmarks to produce. A Panzer IV cost 103,462 Reichsmarks. The Panther, the medium tank that was supposed to be the rational, mass-producible alternative to Tiger extravagance, cost only about 13% less than the Panzer IV, while being considerably more complex to manufacture and maintain. The Tiger cost roughly 50% more in man-hours than the Panther, not the multiple 100% premium that the production myth implies. When you account for the Tiger's superior combat effectiveness, survivability, and the reduced crew casualties that resulted from its heavier armour, the cost premium becomes a rational investment rather than industrial insanity. And let's talk about what those Panzer IVs would have actually faced on the battlefield. The Panzer IV, supposedly the sensible choice that Germany should have mass-produced, had become lethally obsolete by 1944. Its 75mm KWK-40 gun could penetrate Soviet T-34-85 armour at combat ranges. But its own armour couldn't protect its crew from Soviet guns of equivalent calibre. Every engagement became a race to fire first, and the Soviets had more tanks. They could afford to lose them. Germany couldn't. More importantly, the Panzer IV was fatally outmatched against the Soviet IS-2 heavy tank. It was essentially helpless against Allied tank destroyers at anything beyond point-blank range. Building more Panzer IVs meant building more death traps for German crews. Vehicles that required tactical perfection to survive and punished any mistake with total destruction. The Tiger, for all its mechanical complexity, gave its crews a fighting chance against superior numbers. Its armour could absorb hits that would annihilate a Panzer IV. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was ineffective. In a war where trained armoured crews had become Germany's scarcest resource, where every experienced tank commander represented years of training and irreplaceable combat knowledge, a vehicle that kept those crews alive had strategic value beyond simple production arithmetic. The more medium tanks argument implicitly assumes that combat effectiveness scales linearly with vehicle numbers. That two Panzer IVs provide twice the combat power of one Panzer IV. This assumption is false in ways that matter enormously. Two Panzer IVs require two crews to train, two vehicles to fuel, two sets of spare parts to stock, two radio sets to coordinate. They occupy more space in transport, require more logistical overhead, present more opportunities for mechanical failure. They require twice as much rail capacity to move to the front, twice as many fuel trucks to keep operational, twice as many maintenance crews to keep running. The Germans understood this, which is why their armoured doctrine throughout the war emphasised qualitative superiority as a force multiplier. Fewer, better crews in fewer, better tanks, achieving disproportionate results against numerically superior enemies. This wasn't stubborn pride. This wasn't Hitler overriding sensible generals. This was a rational response to the strategic position Germany occupied. Outnumbered, outproduced, but hoping that superior training and equipment could compensate. Now, I should briefly acknowledge the designs that genuinely did represent wasteful fantasy. The Maus prototypes were never deployed. Two vehicles tested at Kummersdorf, one surviving today at Kubinka. 188 tons of engineering curiosity that proved nothing except that you could build a tank that heavy if you really wanted to. The Ratter existed only on paper. A Bismarck on tracks, as the joke goes. Naval guns mounted on a land chassis so absurd that even the Germans recognized it as impractical. More monument than weapon, more propaganda than armour. These designs were follies, certainly. They absorbed engineering attention that might have been better applied elsewhere. But here's what matters. They did not meaningfully affect German armoured strength because they never reached production. The Tiger and King Tiger programs, by contrast, delivered actual tanks to actual units who used them in actual combat. And those units consistently achieved kill ratios that vindicated the investment, when they had fuel, when they had trained crews, when the logistics network could support them. The problem was never the tanks themselves. The engineers who designed the Tiger and King Tiger were solving the problems they were given with the tools they had available. They created machines that dominated their opponents in direct combat. Machines that terrified Allied tank crews and required specialized tactics to defeat. Machines that kept their crews alive in situations where lighter tanks would have been torn apart. What those engineers couldn't solve was the strategic situation that made their work irrelevant. They couldn't conjure fuel from bombed-out synthetic plants. They couldn't repair rail lines faster than Allied bombers could crater them. They couldn't train replacement crews when the training centers had no fuel for exercises. They couldn't make tanks appear at the front when the transportation network had collapsed. The tragedy of German tank production isn't that the engineers made wrong choices. It's that no tank choice could have mattered given the logistical collapse. By 1944, Germany could have built the perfect tank, mechanically flawless, tactically optimal, produced in whatever quantity the factories could manage. And it still wouldn't have reached the front in sufficient numbers to change anything. The critics who spend their time arguing about Panzer IVs versus Tigers are having the wrong argument entirely. They're debating which paint colour would have looked best on a house that was already on fire. The US Army understood this. After the war, their analysts didn't conclude that Germany should have built more medium tanks. They concluded that the logistics collapse made the question irrelevant. The Strategic Bombing Survey documented in exhaustive detail how the systematic destruction of German oil production, transportation infrastructure, and industrial capacity had created a situation where more of anything wouldn't have helped. More tanks? Can't fuel them. More fuel? Can't transport it. More transport capacity? Can't repair the rails. More repair crews? They're being drafted into Volkssturm units. Every proposed solution ran headlong into a different bottleneck. The system wasn't short of one thing. The system was failing everywhere simultaneously. And this is what the armchair historians miss. They look at German tank production and see a single variable that could have been optimized. Build more of the cheaper thing, basic economics. But war isn't basic economics. War is a system. And systems fail in ways that simple production arithmetic can't capture. Germany's system was collapsing. Every node in the network was degraded. Every link was frayed. The people who say they should have built more Panzer IVs are proposing to fix a severed artery with a bigger bandage. The real question, the one that matters, is whether Germany could have made different strategic choices before the logistical collapse made everything else irrelevant. And the answer is yes, probably. But those choices would have had to come years earlier, not different tanks, different wars. Don't invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. Don't declare war on the United States in December 1941. Don't split your forces between multiple fronts that strain your logistics past breaking point. Don't give the Allies years to build the strategic bombing capability that eventually destroyed your fuel production. By the time German planners were choosing between Tigers and Panzer IVs in meaningful quantities, the window for decisions that mattered had already closed. The fuel plants were going to burn regardless of what rolled off the assembly lines. The rails were going to be cut regardless of how many tanks sat waiting in marshalling yards. The argument about German tank production is, in the end, an argument about rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. You can have passionate debates about which deck chairs should go where, You can cite production figures and cost ratios and combat effectiveness studies. None of it changes the fact that the ship was sinking. What bothers me about the more medium tanks argument isn't that it's wrong, though it is. What bothers me is that it's lazy. It takes American assumptions about industrial warfare, assumptions born from a nation with unlimited resources and unthreatened factories, and grafts them onto a country where those assumptions couldn't possibly apply. It ignores the specific constraints German planners actually faced. It ignores the crew shortages. It ignores the fuel crisis. It ignores the transportation collapse. It ignores the rail network disintegration. It ignores everything except production numbers, and then it draws sweeping conclusions from incomplete evidence. The next time someone tells you that Germany should have built more Panzer IVs instead of Tigers, ask them 3 questions. First, where would the additional 5,500 crew members have come from? Second, what fuel would they have burned, given that production had dropped 95% by September 1944? Third, through which rail junctions would they have reached the front, given that capacity had fallen by more than half? Watch them struggle. Because they've never thought about it. They've absorbed a piece of conventional wisdom that sounds plausible and repeated it without examination. The numbers don't support their argument. The logistics don't support their argument. The post-war analysis by the people who actually examined the evidence doesn't support their argument. They're wrong. And now you have the mathematics to prove it. 500 King Tigers consumed 250,000 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres of operation. 2,000 StuGs, delivering equivalent combat power, would have consumed 400,000 litres. The heavy tanks were more fuel efficient per unit of combat effectiveness. The production cost ratio was 3:1, not the inflated 5 or 6:1 that gets cited everywhere. The crew requirements for equivalent combat power favoured the heavy tanks by 5,500 men. The US Army studied this exact question and concluded, no, not my opinion, not internet speculation. The actual investigators, with actual access to actual German records, examined whether building more medium tanks would have helped. Their answer was no. The bottleneck was logistics. The bottleneck was fuel. The bottleneck was trained manpower. The bottleneck was everything except production capacity. And that, finally, is what the endless Tiger debates miss. They're arguments about production when they should be arguments about systems. They're focused on the factory floor when they should be focused on the railway junction and the fuel depot and the training centre. The German engineers who designed and built the Tiger and King Tiger were not fools. They were professionals solving professional problems with professional competence. The tanks they produced were formidable machines that did exactly what they were designed to do. The failure wasn't in the tanks. The failure was in a strategic situation that made any tank design irrelevant. Germany didn't lose because it built the wrong tanks. Germany lost because it fought the wrong war against the wrong enemies at the wrong time. And by 1944, the only remaining question was how long the bleeding would continue. The Tiger didn't cause that, and the Panzer IV couldn't have fixed it. That's the truth that the more medium tanks crowd doesn't want to hear. Because it's complicated, because it doesn't fit in a YouTube comment, because it requires understanding systems rather than optimizing single variables. But it's the truth nonetheless. Subscribe for more stories like this.